It is. We are right on time. We're going to get started. Thank you for everyone for joining the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, otherwise known as YANA, our first quote evening tea of the year. For those of you who went to Yale undergraduate, there are traditionally these evening, used to be called master's teas, but now are sort of the college head teas, physical tea, actual teas in the various residential colleges on campus. And one of our prior board members, Grace Shia, had the idea to do an evening tea format for YANA, where we can have these kind of in-depth conversations. So we're delighted to have Jeff do it. And we're also very happy that this continues to work virtually, so we can still have some terrific conversations. Hopefully everyone had a chance to read Jeff's bio. I don't want to spend time doing that. He is the CEO and founder of Jitasa, which we will get into, but he is an SOM alum and has an interesting background. So, Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you for joining us. I know. All right, we'll talk. We'll get the information quickly, so you don't have to stay up too late. So I want to kind of jump right into the conversation. Jeff, thank you so much for making time. I know you've got a busy and growing organization. One of the things I wanted to start with is that you started in private sector, right? You have an engineering background. You did many years in different kinds of operations, supply chain, and just curious to know, like, what we have a lot of people in our group, and we counsel people a lot about making that transition from private sector. So I'm curious to know, like, what and how led you to decide, like, this was the time to make the switch, and then why business school? And was that the one that made you switch it? So anyway, so go back to kind of a pre nonprofit and talk us through a little bit, like, kind of what you're thinking about, what came up, and then when and how you made that conversion.
Sure. Yeah. So I was an engineer at Georgia Tech down in Atlanta. And at the time when I graduated, I was an industrial engineer. I was really wrestling with, should I go into the business world or should I go do good in the world? And I thought it was an either or choice. Mm-hmm. So I spent 1 year doing volunteer work in Papua New Guinea and in Australia, basically doing like social work with troubled teens. And then I also had an internship with Accenture, and it was, doing these process efficiency projects for DuPont, all these big companies. And what I learned in that process in undergrad was I loved the thrill of Accenture and the pace and the intellectual stimulation and the challenge, but it wasn't all that fulfilling to my soul. Mm-hmm. But I was a terrible social worker. And as I was meeting with these kids, I was like, you guys just need to get your stuff together. Like, I wasn't a good listener, I was I'm not the guy for the campfire. And so in that process, as I graduated, I kind of was like, do I go join the Peace Corps or do I do this? And I ultimately went the business route. So worked at Accenture for a while, got sick of the travel. So then I joined a supply chain company that basically managed portions of Nike's supply chain. Mm. So in the mid 2000s, if you bought Nikes, I was in charge of your leather and your shoe boxes. And so from that experience, that was a company based in Portland. All the shoes obviously are made in Asia. So my boss asked me if I would be willing to relocate to Bangkok, Thailand. So I moved to Bangkok, Thailand, lived there for about 3 years, working with Home Depot and Nike and Hasbro and kind of these big brands, helping them tweak and streamline their supply chain. But then on nights and weekends, Bangkok is sort of the NGO hub of Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. A ton of people live there, and then they travel into Laos and Cambodia, Myanmar, and in Thailand. So I was doing a bunch of volunteer work, and this was kind of in the early 2000s. People didn't know what the internet was. They were like trying to figure out how to set up a website. And just as I'm sitting there one day, it just hits me. I'm like, there's got to be a way to take what I'm doing in my day job and make it affordable and accessible to nonprofits. And it was just kind of, and I don't remember the exact moment, but it was this process in Bangkok. I had this beautiful office looking out, but I looked out over a slum community. Mm. And so every day I was, forced into that juxtaposition of seeing both worlds. And so I had always wanted to do business school. And so I just kind of woke up one day with that idea, and I was like, I'm going to apply to business school, quit my job and try this out. And so that's when I figured out that Yale SOM, about a third of the class has a nonprofit background. I was like, man, this is the perfect match for what I'm wanting to do. So that's what led me to SOM.
And let's talk about SOM a little bit. Do you think, maybe looking back, do you think you needed to go to business school to have made that transition? Do you think you could have done it a different way?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, a ton of people do it without business school. So I think I definitely could have. What I found is insanely beneficial was I think I avoided a ton of mistakes that I otherwise would have made without business school.
Okay.
And so, and the reason, like, when I graduated, the dean at the time was Dean Podolny, and he told me, he said, Jeff, you're one of the first people who are actually going to do what you said you were going to do on your entrance exams or your entrance essays.
Right.
And I remember, like, my original vision when I went to Yale was, I was like, and I wrote about this in my application, I was like, I want to be the back office of the nonprofit sector. Wow. So that was the original audacious goal. And after in every class, like, we'd have a pricing class. Everyone would be doing competitive airline pricing projects or whatever, and I wanted to do a pricing project around nonprofit bookkeeping. And so
you knew right away. It was a test ground for 2 years.
Yeah. So every class, every project, I centered it around what Jatasa became. And so in that process, that's how we settled on finance and accounting, as opposed to being a much broader thing. So that would have been a very probably expensive mistake had I not gone to grad school.
Okay.
But it's also a luxury to sit around and think about a business for 2 years.
Yeah. So other than, I mean, obviously you had this sort of testing ground there, and you started something that was Easy Office. Did you start that? I mean, did you kind of get this on the ground with other SOM classmates, or did you sort of know what you did and you were just running forward with it?
Yeah. So it was a Yale classmate and a Yale classmate's girlfriend. We were kind of the original three. And so Easy Office was just the original name of what is now Jatasa. Mm-hmm. So the same thing we founded in 2008. So a lady named Amy Carson was kind of an original partner with me, and she and Allison Warner, both, when we graduated and set about starting Easy Office or Jatasa, they were located around the New York City area. And then I moved out to Boise to kind of set up and run the operations side. And they were really charged with client service and sales. So that's how it started, was the three of us.
And so you've got this building block of the SOM experience. How did your sort of engineering experiences, obviously you're doing kind of processes and things like that, but did you find yourself drawing specifically on experiences you had working with clients at Accenture or through the supply chain company?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. I always say the challenge at Jatasa, and so for those who don't know, we do basically accounting for nonprofits. The challenge is not the accounting. The challenge is in all the moving pieces and managing all these little bitty small clients and somewhat doing it efficiently and affordably. And so we have a very complex operational model that we don't ever want our customers to feel, right? And so that's really where the engineering came in. I think people who are trained accountants and kind of came up through the accounting profession, there's just kind of a certain way you do things. And I was very early adopter of the cloud, very early adopter of automation. And I think that was just because I came at it from an efficiency standpoint versus an accounting standpoint, where you just kind of crank through it. So that helped us a lot. We have people on 3 different continents serving a $100,000 nonprofit in New Jersey. That's complicated.
Yeah, so let's talk about. So you're starting this. We've got a couple of friends. You're working on different pieces of it, and you're back in Boise in 2008, and then you quickly expanded. What were those first? Let's bring up to 2012 when you became a certified B-Corp. A lot happened. How did you manage that? Was it what you were planning? How did these things kind of grow and come about?
Yeah, we were ambitious from the get-go. We were fortunate that we had investors who were patient with us, so we could make some mistakes and grow, and or we could, invest in growing, which is, really chews up a lot of cash when you're growing. So I remember our first, one of our first breakthroughs was the New York Nonprofit Coordinating Committee. Alice and Amy convinced them to become a partner with us. And we just got flooded with, it was, now we serve over 1,000 nonprofits, but at the time it was like 100 that we signed in a 6-week period or 6-month period. And we should not have done that. It was too fast. We didn't give good service to those, we ended up refunding a ton of money. There's probably still people in New York mad at me. But it was this huge lesson in, it demonstrated to us that the market was there. We just had to figure out how to deliver it consistently and reliably. So those early 3 or 4 years, we were kind of, that for me was the moment where we really proved the market was there. And then we took our lumps sort of in growing pains as we got, I think by, in the first 5 years, we got up to maybe 30 people or something like that. Now we're over 300. So
employees, you mean?
Employees, yeah. The first 30 was kind of the hardest.
I'm sure. Before we kind of go on to
Sure.
big global expansion, I want to go back to I'm thinking, since we've got, I'm sure, a lot of business school people online, what was your business model in the very beginning? How did you want to be a nonprofit? Did you decide no, I'm going to have to do this? The model has to be some kind of fee for service corporate, and then you convince people to invest in you. I mean, obviously, I don't know a whole lot about private equity and venture capital and stuff. That's kind of sounds a little bit what you're doing. What was your business idea to setting up Jatasa or Easy Office back then?
Yeah, so we looked at it, and there are, and that was one of the luxuries of being at Yale, right? So, because we could really just study this. And there are a variety of what are called capacity builders who are nonprofits. And like in Minneapolis, they started up a bookkeeping service, the Minneapolis Association of Nonprofits. There's a couple other states that have done the same thing. And what we observed is none of them made money. Most of them eventually got shut down, and none of them ever got that big. Maybe 3, 4, 5 people. Alaska has a big one, and it's like 10 or 12 people. So as we looked at that, we were like, well, why? And no one wants to donate. It's very difficult for capacity builders to raise money because people want to donate to causes. People want to donate. So donating to someone who's helping a cause is just a little bit disconnected. And so that was one of the big things was we just said, we think for this to become what it can become, we want to have some access to capital. And so that was really the primary driver in being a nonprofit versus a for-profit.
Okay. And so how many initial investors or partners did you get from a financial standpoint?
The first 57 people I asked said no. I remember that number very specifically. But we ended up having about 30 different investors. A couple of family offices have really been the key for us. People who on the foundation side are very philanthropic and giving away a lot of money. And so in their family office, they saw a reasonable long-term investment. So yeah, we have about 30 investors.
Okay, so let's see, you're set up, you've had the sort of bumps along the way the first couple of years. And then at what point you're thinking about, are all your employees are basically focusing out of New York with some back office stuff in Idaho? At what point did you think we need to kind of fix this a little bit and I don't know, set up a slightly different system and have some global expansion? What was that process like?
Yeah, no, because I had lived and worked in Thailand, I was very familiar with working internationally. So I always kind of had that as part of the roadmap. But you got to have a certain scale for that. Back then, you need to have a certain amount of scale for that to make sense. Now, there's a lot of, peer-to-peer type outsourcing that you can do. So you don't really need that much scale. But at the time, you think about setting up an office, hiring 5 to 10 people. So the big thing for us was just when we felt we were big enough, where it would make sense to expand. And that was around 2012, 2013. we signed a large national account, a large federation, and we realized like, oh wow, this is going to bring us a ton of work. So I called an old friend of mine in Bangkok that I used to play basketball with, who was a controller in Southeast Asia for a network of NGOs, and asked him if he would open up the office for us, and he did, and he's still with us. So that's how we ended up in Bangkok to start.
Okay, and I can tell you as a client, full disclosure, all my accountant contacts are in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
How did you pick that place of all places to have
So we were accidentally philanthropic on the Bosnia choice. So we hired a guy in Boise is actually a large Bosnian refugee resettlement area.
Huh, okay.
And so there's a lot of Bosnians here. So we hired a guy named Igor Smartovich, and he worked in our Boise office for a year, was awesome, one of our best employees we'd had. And then he decided to move home to Bosnia. So he moves home to Sarajevo, and he calls me about 3 months later. He says, Jeff, you know, Bosnia is full of all these master degree students because, you know, education's free, but we have like 50% youth unemployment. So we need to, let's start hiring people here. And I said, yeah, that's a terrible idea because we've got an office in Bangkok. Like, we don't need to make it more complicated. So I said, no. 3 months later, he calls me again. I asked around the office. They're like, no, yeah, Igor's awesome. Let's start with him. So we said, okay, all right, Igor, you can do this. Within a few months, there were like 4 people working in Igor's apartment. So I said, okay, I need to go and visit Sarajevo. So I go, and it was wild because we're not that big. But we go, and like USAID, Swiss NGOs, the embassy, they all wanted to meet because at the time there was only about 20 US companies operating in Sarajevo.
Wow.
So it was pretty rare. So the idea that we were going to come and hire people was sort of mind-boggling to them. We're now the second largest foreign employer. Wow. in the services sector.
So how many people do you employ?
About 100 in Sarajevo. Yeah, and so it's interesting. You know, it's obviously there was the conflict there between the Serbs and the Bosnians, and so we had Igor is a Serbian. The very first thing he did was hire a Bosnian female, and so the two of them basically, you know, run and manage our office, which is an incredibly diverse place in Bosnia, and it's beautiful. So.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So some of it's serendipity. Obviously, you have a background, right, from being in a particular place and seeing something and knowing there was opportunity for employment and improving lives, I assume, as well. And then just because Boise, you know, happened to be this, I hadn't realized that, a refugee resettlement city, and you had a really good experience with someone, and then it kind of carried on from there. I have to ask the question because I'm sure some people, I don't know if you get this now, is that as an American US-based mission-driven organization, have you been asked the question, shouldn't those jobs been kept in the US? And I'm sure there's a lot of people who need jobs. And I don't know if it's a skill gap or just that's the way you developed back then. So how do you answer that question when someone says, why are you outsourcing all these jobs outside of our own country? Yeah, no, for sure. And we do get that question. And we do lose potential clients because of it. So my view of the world, you know, the people in these different countries, they're actually all our employees. So we have subsidiaries there, so they receive, you know, B-Corp treatment, if you will. So my view of the world, having lived and worked in these places, is giving anyone a job is something to be proud of, kind of wherever that is, right? You know, 15 to 20% of the sector works in international development. So they love it, right? Community development corporations don't love it. So you know, for us, philosophically, I just believed in, hey, creating a job is creating a job, and that's helping someone and their family, kind of wherever they are. And you know, from
America's standpoint, we really say, okay, well, the value we're creating here in America is the money we're saving all these nonprofits so that they can reinvest in America. So our mission in life is not about job creation. Our mission in life is, help nonprofits.
Help nonprofits. I don't know where they're. And so do you have NGO? Do you have international clients as well as US based? Okay.
We do. They are all US based NGOs, but probably about 200 of our clients have some sort of operations, in the US. The money's flowing through the US, but they have field offices scattered all over the globe.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, Jatasa itself as an organization. So I saw you were a member of UN Global Compact and a certified B Corporation, and you guys won an award for best in governance. So that's amazing. So tell me some of those things, those sort of certifications, awards, recognitions, what you've decided to join and sign on to and not.
Yeah, I'll do the UN Global Compact because that one's easy and ties, and then I'll talk longer about the B Corp. But so the UN Global Compact it's really designed for big Fortune 500 companies. And it's a small program within the UN where companies commit, I think it's 12 development goals. And it's basically rules of conduct for operating in developing countries. And having toured footwear factories, and everyone knows Nike got in a lot of trouble in the 90s, I saw many of those abuses firsthand when I was working there. And so as we opened international offices, we joined the UN Global Compact, and it's basically a signatory type thing. It's not, there's no meat behind it, but it's just a declaration like, hey, we agree to these 12 principles. So that's why we joined the UN Global Compact. We did that at the same time that we started our office in Bangkok. And so basically it's an annual process where I and the board, send a letter every year restating our commitment to these goals. And then it's cool, unrelated, they didn't realize we were a member, that little part of the UN actually became a client. So that's
that's great.
Yeah. So B Corp though, that was a much larger decision. So B Corp started in 2007. Jatasa started in 2008. And so I knew about it, and they came and presented SOM, and they were trying to get going. And I was like, that's really cool. That's exactly, back to my days at Georgia Tech, trying to pair business and doing good. I was like, well, the B Corp is both, I like money, but I also love doing good. Like, well, this is perfect. And but I was scared because it was a new thing. I was scared that I wouldn't be able to raise capital. And so in 2008, I was like, okay, I don't want to scare people off, like being too progressive right out of the gate, which I regret. But in 2012, at this point, we had 30 investors. We had to amend our bylaws to join the B Corp. And so it required unanimous approval of all our investors to do this. And to a person, they're all like, well, this is just who we are anyway. So, why wouldn't we?
So it made it a little easier.
Yeah. So it was interesting, when I did it, so we did it in 2012, I believe, and we've renewed now, I guess, 4 or 5 times. I thought it was gonna be this awesome marketing thing, like nonprofits be like, cool, kumbaya, B Corp, whatever. And it turns out I don't think nonprofits really care that much. I think they care a lot more that we only work with nonprofits. Like that's how we connect with them. But where it has made a huge difference is with our employees. I'll hear people talking about something, or maybe we got a, issue with a client, and people go, well, we can't do that. We're a B Corp. Or, they'll introduce themselves at a party, like, hey, I work at this B Corp, Jatasa, so I found it's something our employees are really proud of. And that's probably been the primary benefit of being a B Corp.
Interesting. Well, you can also say in the same category as, Patagonia and some of these other bigger brand names that people, for consumers, I guess, certainly look into things like that.
That helps, chain, for sure.
Slave labor. I mean, all sorts of stuff that people want to know about. I'm just thinking, so I have to do a shout out. One of our board members, Dimitri, started the first B-Corp bank in New York, Springdale.
Oh, right on.
So they serve a community traditionally, but they've also been able to help sort of small businesses and nonprofits and too. And there aren't very many of those either. So I'm glad to see that it's being spread around.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So also in 2012, you wrote a book. I want to get into that about some of the principles you talked about there, but let's talk about so in those 12 years since you grew, you've got some outsourcing, really growing offices around the world, your investors, your B-Corp, you've signed on to these things, other than obvious implications of a lot of people being remote and pandemic pressures and stuff. I mean, do you think the whole nonprofit, you've been sitting in kind of a unique seat vis-a-vis certain kinds of processes and capacity building for nonprofits. Have you seen that sort of change in any particular way over the past 10 years?
Well, definitely seismic change in the last two.
Sure.
And, a lot of that is just, frankly, is the PPP money made a lot of our clients healthier in a perverse way.
Mm.
So over the last 10 years, there's definitely been, I'll say the 8 years pre-pandemic, there was a growing ease and comfort with working with someone who's off in Idaho or remote or not down the hall.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that had to do with technology. As just people got more and more comfortable with technology, it got easier and easier to provide a remote service. In the nonprofits themselves, a lot of the capacity building, like the nonprofit associations that I was mentioning earlier,
mm-hmm.
They sort of consistently communicated that, hey, overhead is not bad. And I think nonprofits got a little more comfortable going, okay, yeah, we can't just bare bones this, like we got to do it right. We got to do it well. So I think those two messages were probably the big things in the pre-pandemic run up that were, in my world, that were kind of shifts, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then once the pandemic hit, we've grown twice as fast this year as we did the year before, which was twice as fast as ever before. And I think it's just 100% people, instead of going, I might be willing to do something remotely. Also now it's like, oh, how do I do this remotely?
Mm-hmm.
And so they turn to people like us who had been doing this for a long time, who already had the tools and technology and to do it fairly well. And so that was post-pandemic. I think that's been the big shift. And we've seen a lot of our clients even go to virtual, programs, like how they're operating the mission of their nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? Some you can't, just physically, you have to be there physically, and that's tough. But some, we're very creative and we're able to kind of continue even remotely. So I think there's just been a lot of innovation and change in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it's been, I think for the long term will be better.
Yeah, I hopefully continue the ability to take care of a lot of this stuff and be focused on the main missions of the organization. So before we turn to some of these general discussions about outsourcing as capacity building, what do you think has made Jatasa so successful? Like what's your business model? You don't have to give away any secrets, but you're obviously growing. I know you mentioned that you're opening another office in Costa Rica. Why Costa Rica before in any particular?
Yeah, so we wanted something that was U.S. time zone because we already had an operation in Thailand and in Europe. I love surfing, so I wanted to go to Costa Rica. That was a small factor, but no. And Costa Rica is a hub in Latin America for outsourcing, and so Microsoft has 40,000 employees there.
Oh.
Oracle's got 10,000. So it's just a big population of that. So we knew we could get, they teach customer service in high school. It's just part of their ethos and industry. So that was kind of what attracted us to Costa Rica.
Okay, so talking about customer service, if you had your elevator pitch, what makes Jatasa so successful?
Yeah. Probably learning from all the mistakes we made. And probably the number one mistake we made in the early days was but we didn't invest in our people enough. Like we had a really good model. We would win. We were selling like crazy because we were, half the cost of anybody else. And so nonprofits, are pretty much low cost purchasers. So that was great. But we have many clients who've been with us for 12 years and they're happy, but we had many clients where we didn't follow through on our commitment to them. And so really it was about 2012, 2013, where we said, okay, we need to up our pay scale. We had a lot of employees who'd be there for a year or two. We now have a very long tenured, for a company that's only 13 years old, we got a whole lot of people who've been here for 7, 8, or 9. And I really think that's the key to our success, because our business model is all about recurring revenue from nonprofits. And so we want really long-term relationships with those nonprofits. What the nonprofits care, and this is your experience, right, in Sarajevo, is, Jatasa is this thing, whatever, but I deal with Yasmina. And like, Yasmina is that's my Jatasa. Like, so that's make or break, is like how I feel about Yasmina. And so we've gotten better at identifying and using technology, identifying where, if Yasmina is having trouble, we catch it. And we used to have to rely on the client to call us and be like, hey, something's not working. And usually at that point, it's too late. But now, we've got basically robots who can like crawl through all the accounting data and go, hey, this client hasn't been closed in 45 days. What? Someone needs to go figure out what's going on with Yasmina, right? Or, hey, these bills were supposed to get paid every Monday. They didn't get paid Monday. What happened? So we just have far better people paired with systems around kind of exception monitoring. And I think that's been the difference. So if you looked at us in like 2014 to 2016, our NPS score, which is like a customer satisfaction score, was around 40, which is kind of average for a services industry company. We're now, the last 2 years, we've been around 75 or 80, which is almost difficult to get much higher than that. And I think it just comes down to we finally recognize we need to really invest in our people and just really invest and give them the tools to do the job versus relying on them 100%. So I think that's the secret sauce.
Yeah, I mean, do you do sort of employee? I mean, I can tell you, I was professionally raised on Wall Street law firms, and nobody cares, nothing to do with me. It's all about servicing the client, getting it right. And even if you can't get them the answer, the very least you do is call and say, I got your email, I will respond to it. And so, but that was that's in the ethos and the lifeblood of a lot of these, these kinds of organizations. So you've got these disparate offices. Do you have like retreats, certified training, or do you just find people who are like, how do you measure, or how do you find people who are very customer service oriented and are really, really, really good at responding? And that's, I can tell you as a client, I mean, that's hugely helpful.
Yeah, it's funny, like in all of our customer surveys, responsiveness and people's names, like if we do a word cloud, that's what's in the word cloud. Then no one ever's like, man, my books are just so accurate. Like, no. It's like, Yasmina is so nice, right?
Yes.
And if the books, the accurate books is sort of a given. So then we got to deliver beyond that. So I think, we got lucky locating in Idaho. Idaho is just a very nice place. Having lived in the Northeast, it's not quite as abrasive as the Northeast. And so people like that. So I kind of got lucky there. But then we have what we call Jutasta University, where we take people through a 90-day onboarding. They have a mentor who sits with them on client calls for their first year. So we do a lot of things to try to build them up and support them. But ultimately, it's also about like selection, right? So it's finding nice people to work here. We have a very clear no asshole rule. One of our core values is conscientious. And so, that everything from the recruiting through to performance reviews, that's conscientious is a big part of it.
Excellent. And so structurally, what's your, like, how many managers do you have, or is it like, just curious, like how you're
so the way we deliver to clients is we have what we call pods. So it's a 5-person pod, and they may handle 20 or 30 clients.
Okay.
And then those pods are organized into groups that have like a group manager. So you'll have 8 pods in a group. So a group might have, 150, 200 clients.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have directors and VPs that are, sales and operations, and then managing the different groups. But it's a very decentralized, and people have a ton of ownership, right? So you live and die with that. So all of our customer feedback forms automatically get emailed to the entire company once a week. All client termination data automatically gets emailed to the company once a week with your name on it. So there, in the same way we're big on being conscientious, we're really high on accountability. So we give people huge ownership, right? Like 6 months out of school and you got 10 nonprofits you're in charge of. And we'll support you in that, but it's like your own little world there that you got to run and manage. So we're very decentralized in ownership, but we're very centralized in like tools and process definition.
Excellent. That's good. We're trying to set up YANA like that with our chapters. Like we'll have all the stuff support and things like that, and want to give you guys autonomy as long as we all kind of are in the same way. So that's interesting. I'm sure we do lots of programs on that alone of managing people and getting the best out of people. Okay, so that's clear. I mean, I think that comes through, and I know I've made recommendations, and people recommendations are clearly growing, and so keep up that good work.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get to kind of the meat of what it is that Jatasa does: outsourced bookkeeping and accounting, and I got to say, bill paying, all sorts of stuff makes my life easier. You wrote a book on this, and it's a quick read. It's a good read. You guys can see this. Do what you do best: outsourcing is capacity building. And you wrote this back in 2012-13. Did you have this sort of, another kind of aha moment? It's like, I have to write about this. But were you getting pushback, or was it something you just thought like, gosh, we just got to get more people buying in this general concept, and it doesn't have to be bookkeeping and accounting? So what led you, up to that? And I mean, I can kind of summarize, but what are the key takeaways you would love for, it's a lot of the nonprofits or anybody who's thinking about outsourcing. What are the sort of the pros of that when you have to go sell it to your board? Sometimes you got to build it in your budget, or if you're starting out. So tell me a little bit about the general concept of outsourcing as capacity building from your view.
Sure. Yeah. And so what motivated me to write the book was I've now committed 15 years to this concept. So I was just really passionate about it. And actually I was visiting with a former client called Charity Water there in New York City. And basically they just fundraise, and it's all about clean water, but they actually outsource all of their programs. So Charity Water, they just send money to Ghana to a guy to drill the well. But what Charity Water is really good at, founded by a former nightclub promoter, is raising money. And I was talking with him, and I kind of realized, I was like, man, we need more people just to get that concept. Because I think nonprofits always felt like, well, we need to be good at everything, or we need to do everything, or like there was, outsourcing is a for-profit thing. That's kind of big business. That's not us, right? Like we gotta have our own little world. And so it was in that conversation where I was like, man, we got to just get the word out there. And also, I always tell people our number one competition isn't other people doing what we do. There's probably 30 or 40 smaller firms doing what we do. Our number one thing is the status quo, right? People just not thinking about a firm. And so that was really kind of the impetus behind doing it. The concept of the book, goes back to my own experience in Papua New Guinea of being a terrible social worker. Because I was like, most of these nonprofits are founded and run by people who are passionate about the mission. And it's everything from, they're passionate about youth development, or they're passionate about education. And that's where their brain goes. That's what they think about when they read a book late at night. That's what they're thinking about. And they could care less about the operations and all the other stuff. And as I was meeting with clients and talking to them, and I'd be like, hey, well, how were your books last week? You could immediately just see the energy drain out of them. And if I said, hey, tell me about your, after school care program. Oh, they'd light up and they talk about it, and they're all fired up. And so that's the basic premise of the book, which is, hey, we've got 300 people who get fired up about doing accounting. Like they're getting excited about that. And so let's tap into that. And you guys don't spend time with us. You guys spend time with the after school program, and like, that's going to be better for society as a whole. So that's the basic premise.
Yeah. And I'm sure, have you ever helped nonprofits kind of put together, or an executive director or somebody who's like the CFO, put kind of the pitch together back to their board or to their management team or something like that?
Yeah, we do it all the time. Because so typically, an executive director or CFO will approach us, and then it almost always goes to the board, which I find weird, but it does. So we have a whole pitch where we kind of walk through, hey, here's why this is a good idea. Do you deal with staff turnover? Do you understand all the different nonprofit rules? Do you have all these different skill sets in one person? So we kind of try to hit all the main talking points for groups.
Is there, just curious, trending wise, is there a particular point in nonprofit growth where you end up seeing most of your clients? Is it like while people are starting out and setting up processes and stuff, or is it, I don't know, is there a certain point you traditionally see the clients come to you?
Yeah, typically there is a size, which I'll talk about, but typically people come to us because of some sort of change. Somebody quit, or audit went horribly, or someone committed fraud, or so it's usually there's for us, some sort of changes, or they're growing really fast, or they're shrinking. Like some sort of change is what prompts them to approach us. As far as size wise, we do have two different segments. We have one we call Groundswell, which is basically for startups and nonprofits who have operating budgets of under 200 grand. Typically all volunteer. So we have a team that only works with those clients, and we only work with them 3 or 4 or 5 hours a month. But I kind of believe those are the people who are doing some of the most important work in the sector. And so a lot of other firms can't make money with clients that small, but we've sort of figured out how to do it sustainably. So we have that segment, but then probably our sweet spot, the majority of our revenue, majority of our clients are nonprofits who always say are big enough to be complicated, but they're not big enough to have figured it out themselves. And that's anywhere from, 5 staff to 50 staff. So kind of in that like 500 grand to $4 or $5 million operating budget. That's where the vast majority of our clients are. That's where that's where I think we provide some of the most value, because they're big enough that they need a CFO, but they only need that 5 hours a month. They need a financial analyst maybe quarterly, and then they got thousands of transactions every week that they need to be properly done. So finding that mix of skills, but your total annual budget's only 4 million. That's like, you're not going to hire a 3-person department.
Right.
So that kind of tends to be our sweet spot.
Okay. So let's thinking more broadly. You've sort of been agnostic about what people outsource, and there are probably lots of different areas. I mean, we could probably rattle off the top of our head a few of them. Legal is one of them. IT, we've probably seen a growth in now. Admin, fundraising and development, you've even talked about. Rent, just having someone else manage your space and things like that. What do you think about nonprofits, or maybe taking advantage of this, what's otherwise been called like the gig economy? There are lots of freelancers out there, so maybe there's a Jatasa kind of groups, but then you need someone who kind of knows what they're doing. What do you think about using platforms like Upwork, or another alternative model than totally outsourcing? You either do it individually and kind of piece it together yourself, or I know there's a little bit about nonprofits joining together to kind of do pooled or shared admin needs. I don't know how. I mean, I've looked at that a little bit. I'm just curious to know what you've seen about that, and if anybody on the call has experience specifically with outsourcing and using some of these other. I've used Upwork a lot for kind of tasks, but even for some things that I don't have an IT department, but I know what I need, so I can manage someone. But anyway, just curious to know from your standpoint what some of these other models look like.
Yeah, I think absolutely seeing an increase in that, and in particular, like around donor management and donor managing some of that data. We see a lot of people kind of using freelancers for that type of work. I think it's a great solution but it can be hit or miss, right? So the quality and consistency you get through something like that, sometimes it's awesome and it goes super smooth. Sometimes it doesn't. I encourage people, I'm like, well, just try it. Like, maybe you'll get lucky. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Like, the other thing I think that's sort of holding that back, and this is where state associations play a really important role,
Right.
is just there's a ton of, it's a search cost, right? There's a ton of time and energy that goes into managing it and finding it and figuring it out. And like, what exactly do I post on Upwork, and do I have to interview 4 people and then pick one? And, so it, where I think state associations provide a lot of value is they can kind of screen and say, here's our list of preferred HR providers, and here's 5 freelance HR consultants. And here, so a lot of these state associations have those sorts of lists in their local communities. And so I think that's really valuable. And that's something that did not exist when we started, 13 years ago. And I shouldn't say did not exist, was not as prevalent as it is now.
Yeah, I can tell you, like, we're starting to share our research knowledge with other alumni groups, because
that's awesome.
We had to spend a long time, like, where do we host our website? What's our database supposed to be? What email system do I use? And I've done some programs and realized everybody's in the same spot. Like, you're right. Like, why should the nonprofit or alumni group or whatever it is they're doing have to spend all this time rethinking the wheel on this? And, I'm not saying this is the best one out there, but I can certainly give you, like, I interviewed a bunch of people. I'll give you guys a list of people I looked at. Start there at least, right? Totally. And I have to give a shout out. We have I'm just blanking on his name. We have a Yale alum is actually the head of the National Council of Nonprofits, which kind of holds together all these state associations of nonprofits. And so maybe time to bring him back and talk about, he was very busy with the PPE stuff and some of these regulations and the tax code and stuff. But yeah, I know we've all gone there, and to board source from what do we search under defined list of such state association? I think you could find your local, if you're like in Georgia, you would find Georgia National, nonprofit association. I think if you go to this state, into the head one, the National Council of Nonprofits, you'll see under them. Thank you, Liana. Thank you. Who's there? I have to say, being now a Texas resident, Texas is one of the few states that did not, their association has not joined on, but it's a tremendous resource. In places like New York, there are also lots of city ones. There's New York lawyers, anyway, there's all sorts of ones. There are national ones. Join if you want. They usually have resources pages and there are things like that. Tim Delaney, thank you. Tim Delaney, President and CEO of National Council of Nonprofits. He is a Yale grad. So we've had him on. I think maybe time to bring him back. And you're now the second person who's encouraging nonprofits to take advantage of some of these, pooled resources and as you said, the research work.
Well, Tim's an interesting character because the National Council for Nonprofits went through a period where they were really focused on capacity building. And Tim has got them increasingly focused on lobbying and collective voice of the nonprofit sector that was missing. So he's doing really important work on multiple fronts.
Yes. And they do have good resources pages. Thank you, Liana, who, again, we outsourced Liana, who's another Yale alum sitting in Colorado, has a full-time day job, and she also worked part-time for us on communications, and handy to have her there throwing up some resources for us. Thank you, and all this is on our website as well. All right, so I want to, as you should feel now to ask some questions. Oh, here we go, already getting them in. And Jeff, if we didn't touch on anything you feel like we really should be talking about, feel free to put that in, but I'm seeing some questions.
Questions be great.
I've got a question from a fellow YANA board member, curious about how Jatasa handles the balance between providing meaningful managerial information and then organizing the chart of accounts around 990s and that kind of detail stuff.
Yeah, so that's, we put everybody on a standard chart of accounts. In the mid 2000s, they came out with some, Indiana University Center for Philanthropy came out with something called the Unified Chart of Accounts. And it was, the idea is it was 700 lines long, but it had everything that a nonprofit would need.
Right.
So we take that and we kind of accordion it down to 150 lines that your specific nonprofit needs. So we start there, because if your chart of accounts is done correctly, then you can get the managerial accounting that you need. And so we really believe 90% of the work is in the structure and, garbage in, garbage out, the structure and just really quality data entry. And that's where we use a ton of automation tools just to avoid errors. And then the managerial piece of it is really about, I think accountants get so proud of all the little numbers matching that they're not good at stepping back and going, okay, well, here's what this tells us. And so we've actually learned that many of our staff actually aren't accountants. They're finance majors. So like in the US, because they're the ones communicating with clients and explaining things to them, finance majors actually do a better job than accountants. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of shifted our employee makeup a little bit on that exact issue.
And quite frankly, you don't have your own platform. A lot of this goes through QuickBooks, right? I mean, so you didn't have to reinvent the wheel on that even. And
yeah, I was thinking about that when we were talking about search cost for people mm-hmm. finding Upwork, whatever. We use about 30 different apps that any nonprofit could go and sign up for all these 30 different things. But it'd be really difficult and be very expensive. So us doing that and then rolling it out to 1,000 people is valuable. But it's all, we have some internal tools, but it's more around our own workflow, like how we move work between Bangkok and Bosnia. Mm-hmm. Client facing, it's all just third-party apps.
And so managerial stuff, I know that whatever default you guys helped us set up, I can go click on managerial reports and it sort of shows up and it's got our logo on it. It has oh, this is really great. I don't have to download a spreadsheet or do anything. It's just tremendously helpful. And then even when you said, and I got to the point, and I'm sure you have this with your clients, they sign up for one thing and then they're like, okay, I really need you guys to do this too. Can you do our tech? Like that's how we started, because it's like, you guys are so good. And you do have the capacity to do the 990s, right? To do the mm-hmm. federal tax filings, to handle bill payment, incoming and outgoing. Talk about with the pandemic. I mean, I'm sure you saw this for nonprofits. There were checks sitting in physical offices all over cities that staff couldn't get to, and we'd be like, "Where is our donation check? Our money?" They couldn't. It was like it's in a lock. Anyway, so that everything's now online. It's flowing beautifully, and I know it's not your proprietary stuff. It's these other little websites you guys have pieced together. So
right, yeah, exactly. We spent a lot of time just sort of watching the ecosystem. And QuickBooks is, what QuickBooks is today versus what it was 5 years ago versus what it was 10 years ago is night and day. So it's, it does 99% of what nonprofits need it to do. And it's by far the most affordable. And so we've got, $10 million, $15 million nonprofits running on QuickBooks, and it works fine.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, is when for those of you out there maybe thinking about outsourcing stuff, it's like you said, it's like, oh, QuickBooks, I could follow that. I'm smart enough to figure out how to do it. And then you're like, why would I do this? Like, can I and then I'm tired of like uploading, copies of receipts and paying this bill and get it and it all comes together, and you guys have figured out how to pull it, which I just find on a systems efficiency basis just beautiful. I had a question. People wanted to know, does Jatasa help produce annual financial statements, and what about financial forecasting? And I guess it's
we do forecasting, and we'll do like managerial reporting, but we're not a CPA firm, so we don't do like financial reviews or audits or anything like that. But we do, for the purposes of a board or donors. We do a lot of managerial reporting around that. We use a tool called Fathom that does dashboards. Clients sometimes will put in impact data into those dashboards, so you can look at cost per outcome. Again, another third-party app that's cloud-based. You can pull it up on your phone if you're bored on the subway, I guess.
Right, and that we don't have payroll, but I assume payroll can be a input.
Yes, we do payroll for people. Yeah.
All sorts of other things that I'm glad. I don't know what.
I always describe it. We basically become the accounting department for the nonprofit. So it's just everything you would think of an accounting department doing. That's what we do.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Let's see. Does Jatasa produce multi-year budgeting?
Yeah, we do. So we formed a team called the Jitasa Strategic Advisory Team, JSAT. And it is comprised of former nonprofit CFOs. And so a lot of like the forecasting, multi-year budgeting would fall on that team. So they're, highly experienced, highly capable people. but you might spend 20 hours with them and getting it all set up. And then you'll spend, 5 hours a quarter having them review things. And we very intentionally hired former nonprofit employees because we wanted them to understand it, and from an advisory standpoint, not just hey, here's the numbers.
Right. And we still have accounting lines that says, profit and loss and sales, and we don't do any of that stuff, but we could probably just jiggle around the words a little bit. But yeah, I got to say, when we started, we were trying to move from this spreadsheet phase and someone just doing this into real accounting lines. And I had to explain to the board and the finance committee, apples versus oranges. I'm like, no, this is really what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to call that, not this word we made up in the spreadsheet. But once you get that in there, it's so much easier doing the budget. It was the first year we've ever had a budget done and approved before the year end. Because usually we're just trying to figure things out or manually, but it was so beautiful to have it in the right format and have it done right away. So
that's awesome.
Okay, let's see. Do you have individual church, synagogues, and mosque clients or religious institutions, and what size do you generally?
Yeah, we do. So if you think of the nonprofit sector, we serve the full range. So we work with schools, work with all the different types of nonprofits, and we also work with religious organizations. So we serve synagogues, mosques, churches, other places of worship. Size-wise, it's probably similar to our kind of that $500,000 to $5 million operating budget. Could be a membership or a congregation of anywhere from 50 to, I think we had one that had 5,000 members. So kind of in that same range. We don't really have a cap on the size of clients we work with. For a while, the American Museum of Natural History, they're in New York with all the dinosaurs. They were a client of ours, and they're $100 million operating budget. So it's really more about the so we don't really have a size that we work with.
Well, I have to. I don't know if you can see the chat function. You're getting lots of kudos and thanks from people who have been on the client side and met.
Saw New York Pace pop up. Thank you.
NY Pace, John, who's at Johnson & Johnson, is also a member of New Nonprofit Board. So hopefully, it's helping, but a lot of these things pass by word of mouth. And just delighted you were able to share some time and share the story behind Jatasa and just generally about kind of what's going on with the outsourcing department. If anybody has any questions, put them in. We'll wrap up in the next couple of minutes. But Jeff, any other takeaways you want to tell the nonprofit word and help spread it? We can, we've got 8,000 people in our network, and each one of those probably is on another nonprofit board. Food for thought, things to think about, what we can do.
Yeah, no, I think that with all the changes in the world right now, it's a great time to stop and analyze and think about what should we be doing, what should we not be doing. Mm-hmm. That's really kind of the premise behind the outsourcing do what you do best is, I remember one of our very first clients, he was a volunteer working for a small nonprofit out of Stamford, Connecticut. And he called me, he said, man, I was going to the PO box to pick up the checks, and I just realized this is dumb. Why am I doing this? And so everything from a small nonprofit to large nonprofits, I think we all get into habits and routines, and it's kind of always been done that way. And I think, unfortunately, COVID's forced us all to rethink things personally, professionally. And so I just think now is kind of a good time for boards to step back and go, well, should we still be doing those programs? Should we still be doing that administrative duties? Are there things we should just stop, or are there things we should get help? But I just think it's a good time, just kind of in the macro environment.
Excellent. And I have one last question, because this was a point you made in your book about kind of overhead and how grantors and funders think about that. Someone just asked a question, so maybe that's a good time to do it, since there's a lot changing on the funding models out in the world as well. Is overhead a nasty word? What's the it's good and necessary. What you're going to call it, your take on that, what that was originally, and maybe where you've seen some change to that now.
Yeah, and I think the work that GuideStar and Charity Navigator, I think a happy Jutasta client, Jutasta client anyway. The work they've done to move away from just having an overhead ratio be the number, I think that's helped. Quite frankly, it's a conversation that's mainly happening among nonprofits, is my observation.
Okay.
And when I talk to foundations, they're kind of like, huh, what?
Huh.
So I think it's reached some ears, and I think it's way better than it was 5 years ago. But I think outside of the largest foundations, there's still a ton of work to be done.
Somebody asked a question, have you as Jatasa or anybody, do you know anybody's making presentations or any of these grant makers or funders kinds of conferences or organizations about this kind of outsourcing? And
yeah, I would love to. I have talked to them a few times, but it tends to be very like-minded groups.
Okay.
Who will say, hey, because we've actually had foundations who will approach us and say, hey, can we give you money directly and then you support our grantees? So we've done that a couple of times. It doesn't work great because the grantees they don't love that arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
But there are foundations that understand, like they get back the bad financial reports and they get back the bad metrics and reporting. They go, man, these people need, like what, why? So I think there is a sense, a growing sense that overhead is a problem. However, back to like what Tim Delaney's doing, one of the fundamental problems is really like how the federal money flows, which is half of the nonprofit sector's cash flows, still tends to be very overhead based.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done to improve that.
Okay, good. Well, this certainly gives us some things to work on and think about as we think of mobilizing the Yale community. And we've got some people, obviously, and you mentioned the accounting unified charts. One of our alums, Amir Pasek, is the dean of the Indiana School of Philanthropy. So we've got some good people in a lot of different places, and we've got some ways to pull us all together and make some meaningful impact. And people who run major foundations too. And I know we have a lot of community funds around. They're doing smaller local impacting, and they may have some. I'd be curious to bring them on and see what they think about some of this overhead, maybe for future programming. Well,
yeah, I think,
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it used to be like, oh, you need to be 10% overhead. And I think the progress is now people are like, 25% overhead's okay. In reality, it shouldn't be part of the conversation, right? It should just be, this is what's required to run an organization. No one thinks about Tim Cook's salary when they use their phone. It's an unfair standard. I think it's going to be very difficult to get rid of it because it's so ingrained, particularly among just people who are casual donors.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a huge challenge. So I think as much as we can kind of get the word out that like, hey, overhead's not bad.
Okay, you've given us something. I'm going to probably bring some folks back, and we'll have some more conversations about this.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you everyone for joining us and sticking with us for this hour. Jeff, thank you so much. One, for creating Jatasa and doing your work there, and thanks for sharing your insights and your knowledge. And I hope you get some more clients. We're very happy, and it's more than just getting you clients. It's actually improving the work that the nonprofits are doing. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll see you again in the future. Keep up the good work. Everybody stay safe. And we'll see you in another YANA program in the future. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rachel.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.